The merciless summer sun beat down on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a small frontier town nestled at the foot of the imposing Sierra Nevada mountains. The year was 1878, and like many settlements that had sprung up during the gold rush, this one teetered between civilization and lawlessness. Margaret Sullivan wiped her brow with the back of her hand, careful not to smudge the ink in the ledger before her. At 32, she stood out in this rough-hewn town, educated, refined, and determined to make something of the small apothecary shop she had inherited from her late father. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes reflected both intelligence and a sorrow that ran deep. The townsfolk had never fully accepted her, a woman running a business alone in a man's world. The whispers followed her everywhere. Widow, outsider, too proud for her own good. I'd like to kindly ask that you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, which city are you watching from today? Outside, the usual afternoon commotion was building at the Lucky Nugget, the saloon across the street that seemed to swallow men whole and spit them out, either richer, poorer, or occasionally not at all. Margaret sighed as she heard the piano's tinny notes drifting through her open door, along with the raucous laughter that made her skin crawl. She had learned to endure it, just as she had endured the thinly veiled propositions from Walter Blackwood, the wealthy cattle baron who owned half the businesses in town and had set his sights on owning her as well. His latest offer to save her from financial ruin by purchasing her shop still stung. Margaret closed the ledger with a decisive thud. The numbers didn't lie. She had 3 months, maybe 4, before she would have to sell or face destitution. Her father's debts, coupled with the boycott Blackwood had quietly orchestrated, were slowly strangling her business. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the main street, the town's weekly stagecoach rumbled in, bringing supplies, mail, and occasionally, new faces. Margaret glanced up, just as a figure unlike any she'd seen before stepped down from the coach. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and a beard that reached mid-chest, as wild as the mountains themselves. His buckskin jacket was weathered by years in the elements, and a Bowie knife hung at his hip alongside a worn Colt revolver. What struck her most, however, were his eyes, steel blue and watchful, taking in every detail of the town with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to danger. Those eyes briefly met hers through the shop window, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a flutter of curiosity, perhaps even hope. Ezekiel Stone had spent 15 years in the high country, trapping and hunting, speaking more to his horse than to any human being. The wilderness had shaped him, hardened his body, sharpened his senses, and taught him to value silence. But it had not extinguished the embers of who he once was, a decorated Union Army captain with an education and a conscience that still burned beneath his rough exterior. He had come down from his cabin in the mountains for the first time in 3 years, driven by necessity rather than desire. His supplies were dangerously low, and the coming winter promised to be brutal. The letter in his pocket, yellowed with age but never forgotten, was his other purpose: to finally lay to rest the ghosts that had driven him to the solitude of the mountains in the first place. The town looked like a dozen others he had passed through. False fronts hiding flimsy structures, businesses catering to men's vices, and the sharp division between those who had struck it rich and those still scrabbling in the dirt for dreams. Ezekiel led his pack horse toward the general store, intent on completing his business quickly. But something caught his attention. A woman standing alone in an apothecary shop, her posture defiant, despite the worry etched on her face. Their eyes met briefly, and Ezekiel felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not of her face, but of her spirit. He tipped his hat slightly before continuing on his way, unaware that this simple gesture of respect would be noted by watchful eyes along the boardwalk. Margaret's heart raced as she approached the bank the following morning. In her reticule was every cent she had managed to scrape together, enough to make this month's payment on her father's loan, but barely. The bell jingled cheerfully as she entered, a sound at odds with the cold reception that awaited her. Theodore Simmons, the bank manager, peered at her over wire-rimmed spectacles, his thin lips pressed together in disapproval. Behind him stood Walter Blackwood, his expensive suit and gold watch chain advertising his wealth as loudly as a carnival barker. "Ah, Miss Sullivan," Blackwood said, his voice oily with false concern. "I was just discussing your situation with Mr. Simmons. I understand things have been difficult." The way his eyes traveled over her made Margaret's skin crawl, but she kept her chin high. "My payment, Mr. Simmons," she said, ignoring Blackwood and placing the money on the counter. "In full and on time, as agreed." Simmons counted it slowly, exchanging a glance with Blackwood before clearing his throat. "I'm afraid there's been a change in terms, Miss Sullivan. The bank has decided to call in the remainder of your loan, in full." Margaret felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her. "That's impossible. We had an agreement. Monthly payments for 3 years. I have it in writing." Blackwood stepped forward, placing a hand on the counter, uncomfortably close to hers. "Business is business, my dear, but my offer still stands. I'd be willing to take the shop off your hands and perhaps arrange something more comfortable for you personally." His meaning couldn't have been clearer, and Margaret felt tears of rage and desperation burning behind her eyes. "You orchestrated this," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "You've wanted my father's property since before he died, and now you're using the bank to steal it." Blackwood's smile vanished. "Careful, Miss Sullivan. Accusations of that nature could be considered slander. I'm simply a businessman, recognizing an opportunity." Margaret felt the first tears spill down her cheeks, hot with humiliation and anger. "You have 1 week to pay in full, or vacate the premises," Simmons added, not meeting her eyes. The sound of laughter made her turn. 3 men had entered the bank and were watching the exchange with undisguised amusement. "Look at that, boys," one said loudly. "The high and mighty Miss Sullivan finally realizes she can't make it in a man's world without a man." The tears came faster now, beyond her control, and the men's laughter grew louder. Margaret gathered what dignity she could and turned to leave, only to find her path blocked by Blackwood's foreman, a cruel-faced man named Harlan. "Maybe you should reconsider the boss's generous offer," he sneered, "unless you're planning to work at the Lucky Nugget. I hear they're always looking for new talent." Fresh guffaws erupted, and Margaret felt herself shrinking, becoming small under their mockery. The bell above the door jangled again, and suddenly the laughter died. Ezekiel Stone filled the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning light. The mountain man's presence seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room as his cold blue eyes took in the scene before him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle as he stepped aside to let Margaret pass. But she remained frozen, tears still streaming down her face. Ezekiel's gaze traveled from her to the laughing men, then to Blackwood, and finally to Harlan, who had instinctively backed away. "Seems to me," Ezekiel said slowly, his hand resting casually near his holster, "that gentlemen don't find amusement in a lady's distress." Harlan's hand drifted toward his own gun. "This ain't your business, stranger. Move along." The tension in the bank was suddenly thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret held her breath as Ezekiel stepped fully into the room, each movement deliberate and controlled. "I'm making it my business," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had faced death many times and never blinked first. What happened next occurred so quickly that Margaret would later struggle to recall the exact sequence. Harlan went for his gun, but before it cleared the holster, Ezekiel moved with startling speed for a man of his size. The mountain man's fist connected with Harlan's jaw with a sickening crack, sending him sprawling across the bank's polished floor. The other men who had been laughing suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, backing toward the door with their hands raised. "I believe the lady was leaving," Ezekiel said, extending his arm toward Margaret in an unexpected gesture of gentlemanly courtesy. Something about the mountain man's quiet strength broke through her paralysis, and she placed her trembling hand on his offered forearm. Together, they walked out of the bank, leaving behind a stunned silence. The morning sun felt different on Margaret's face as they emerged onto the boardwalk. Brighter somehow, despite her world crumbling around her. She became acutely aware of her tear-streaked cheeks and attempted to compose herself. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," he supplied. Ezekiel Stone. His voice had a gravelly quality, as if unused to conversation. "I apologize for interfering, but I've never had patience for bullies." Margaret nodded, finding her voice at last. "Margaret Sullivan. And there's no need to apologize. That was the first time anyone in this town has stood up for me." She paused, suddenly embarrassed by her vulnerability. "Not that I usually need defending. I've managed on my own for 3 years." Ezekiel studied her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "Independence and accepting help when needed aren't mutually exclusive, Miss Sullivan." Back in her shop, Margaret's hands still trembled as she measured out willow bark for Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism. The morning's humiliation burned in her memory, but alongside it was the image of Ezekiel Stone standing in the bank doorway. A mountain made flesh. She had invited him to stop by the apothecary if he needed any medicines or salves before returning to the high country, an offer he had accepted with a nod before disappearing into the general store. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like him didn't linger in towns. The bell above her door jingled, and Margaret looked up, her carefully composed greeting dying on her lips as Walter Blackwood stepped inside. His usual smug expression had been replaced by cold anger. "Your mountain man friend made a serious mistake this morning," he said without preamble. "Harlan's jaw is broken in 2 places." "Mr. Stone is not my friend," Margaret replied, keeping the counter between them. "And from what I recall, Harlan reached for his gun first." Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "You think that matters? No one lays hands on one of my men without consequences. When he shows his face again, he'll learn what it means to cross me." He leaned across the counter, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "My offer still stands, Margaret. The shop and my protection in exchange for companionship. 1 week. Then I'll own this place anyway, and you'll have nothing to bargain with." When she didn't respond, he straightened his expensive coat with a smirk. "Think carefully. In this town, you're either with me or against me. and no one survives being against me for long." After Blackwood left, Margaret sank onto her stool, mind racing. 1 week to come up with an impossible sum, or lose everything her father had built. She knew what awaited women with no means in frontier towns: either marriage to any man who would have them, or work in establishments like the Lucky Nugget, where women sold themselves by degrees until there was nothing left to sell. Neither option was acceptable. She was still lost in thought when the bell jingled again, and this time it was Ezekiel who entered, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe. He carried a burlap sack that he set carefully on the counter. "I need supplies," he said simply, "for wounds, fevers, pain." Margaret nodded, professional instincts taking over as she gathered various remedies, explaining each one's use. As she worked, Ezekiel studied the shelves of neatly labeled bottles and jars. "You know your medicines," he observed. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "My father was a doctor. He taught me everything he knew, though women aren't allowed to practice officially." She hesitated, then added, "He came west to start over after my mother died. Brought me with him when I was just a girl." This shop was supposed to be temporary until he could establish a proper practice. But then the gold played out, the town changed, and she trailed off, unprepared for the surge of emotion. "He died last year. Pneumonia. I couldn't save him despite everything he taught me." Ezekiel nodded, and in his eyes was understanding rather than pity. Some things can't be fought, no matter how much we know or how hard we try. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken recognition. As Margaret packed his purchases, Ezekiel cleared his throat. "I heard what Blackwood said about the loan." Margaret stiffened. "The walls in this town have ears, it seems." "And eyes," Ezekiel agreed. "I also heard about the boycott, how Blackwood's been pressuring people not to come to your shop. Men like him, they exist in every territory I've traveled. They mistake wealth for worth." Margaret sighed, suddenly tired of pretending. "He'll win. In 1 week, I lose everything, unless I accept his arrangement." She nearly spat the last word. Ezekiel's expression darkened. "There are other options." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Name one that doesn't involve selling either my shop or myself." Ezekiel was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then, to Margaret's astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee before her. "Marry me," he said simply, his deep voice matter-of-fact, as if he were suggesting nothing more significant than a business transaction. Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What? A marriage of convenience," he elaborated, still kneeling. "As my wife, you'd have protection under the law that you don't have as a single woman. Blackwood couldn't touch you or your property without going through me first. And he paused, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face. "I have gold, enough to pay off your loans several times over." Margaret's mind raced, trying to make sense of this unexpected proposal from a man she had met mere hours ago. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know me." Ezekiel rose to his full height again, his expression serious. "I know enough. I know you're fighting to keep what's rightfully yours. I know you have knowledge that saved lives, including your father's patients. And I know men like Blackwood see women as property to be acquired." He glanced down at his massive, scarred hands before meeting her eyes again. "I've been alone in the mountains for 15 years, Miss Sullivan. I'm not fit for town life or fancy company. But I have means and I still remember what justice looks like. This arrangement would benefit us both. You keep your independence and your shop. I get supplies and medicines I need without coming to town." He gestured to his purchases. And perhaps company, occasionally. Conversation, if wanted. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. The offer was unexpected, unconventional, and yet tempting in ways she hadn't anticipated. A marriage in name only, to a man who seemed to value her autonomy when everyone else sought to diminish it. "I would need time to consider," she said finally. Ezekiel nodded. "Of course, but not too much time. Blackwood strikes me as a man who doesn't like to lose, and he'll have heard about our interaction by now." As if summoned by his name, the door burst open, and Harlan stood there, his jaw visibly swollen and his eyes glazed with pain and fury. Behind him were 3 more of Blackwood's men, hands hovering near their weapons. "There he is, boys," Harlan slurred through his damaged jaw. "The mountain bastard who thinks he can come to our town and interfere in our business." Ezekiel moved with deceptive calm, positioning himself between Margaret and the men. "I've no quarrel with any of you," he said evenly. "Unless you make one." Harlan spat on the floor of Margaret's immaculate shop. "Too late for that. Boss wants to see you, now." His hand moved to his gun. "And we're not asking nice." Margaret's heart froze as she realized what was happening. Blackwood was moving against Ezekiel, just as he'd threatened, and it was because of her, because Ezekiel had defended her. Before she could speak, Ezekiel's voice cut through the tension. "I'll come. No need for guns in the lady's shop." His eyes found Margaret's, and in them was a clear message. Stay here. Stay safe. Then, with dignity that seemed at odds with his wild appearance, he walked out, surrounded by Blackwood's men. As the door closed behind them, Margaret stood frozen for only a moment before rushing to the window. Across the street, she could see Blackwood standing on the porch of the Lucky Nugget, watching with satisfaction as his men marched Ezekiel toward him. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, sensing the confrontation brewing. Margaret knew she should stay put, as Ezekiel had silently instructed. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But as she watched Blackwood's smug face and Ezekiel's proud bearing, something broke loose inside her. Years of submission, of swallowing her words, of enduring this town's judgment and Blackwood's predatory advances. Without conscious decision, she grabbed her father's old medical bag and hurried out the door. The crowd that had gathered on the main street parted for Margaret, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. She heard whispers following her. Sullivan woman's lost her mind, getting herself involved in men's business. But she ignored them, focusing instead on the scene unfolding before the Lucky Nugget. Blackwood stood on the porch, looking down at Ezekiel with the satisfied expression of a cat cornering a mouse. "So you're the mountain man who thinks he can waltz into my town and assault my employees," he was saying as Margaret approached. "Seems to me you need a lesson in respect and local customs." Ezekiel stood tall, seemingly unconcerned by the guns trained on him from multiple directions. "The only custom I saw was men mocking a lady in distress. Not one I care to respect." Blackwood's face darkened. "Miss Sullivan has been offered my protection repeatedly. Her stubbornness is her own choice." His eyes flicked to Margaret as she pushed through the last of the crowd. "Speak of the devil. Come to watch your champion's downfall, Margaret?" Every head turned toward her, and Margaret felt the weight of the town's collective gaze. For a moment, her courage faltered. Then she looked at Ezekiel, this stranger, who had shown her more respect in one day than she had received in years, and found her voice. "I've come to speak the truth, Mr. Blackwood. Something rarely heard in your presence." A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one had ever challenged Blackwood publicly, certainly not a woman. "And what truth would that be?" Blackwood asked, his tone mocking, but his eyes hard with warning. Margaret took a deep breath, stepping forward to stand beside Ezekiel. "That you arranged with the bank to call in my loan against our legal agreement. That you've intimidated my customers and suppliers to force me into financial ruin. That you've offered to save me only if I agree to become your mistress." She raised her voice to ensure everyone could hear. "And that when I refused, you threatened me." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Blackwood's facade of civility slipped, revealing the rage beneath. "Careful, woman. You've no proof of these wild accusations, and slander is a serious offense." Margaret stood her ground. "I have witnesses to your threats this morning, and I suspect if others were brave enough to speak, they'd confirm your pattern of taking what you want by any means necessary." An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Margaret could see recognition in many eyes. Others who had suffered under Blackwood's tactics, but had been too afraid to speak out. Blackwood sensed it too, and his strategy shifted. "This is absurd. I've been nothing but generous to this community. I provide jobs, stability, investment, and this is the thanks I get? Wild accusations from a failing shopkeeper and interference from some unwashed trapper?" He gestured dismissively at Ezekiel. "Take him to the sheriff. Let's see what the law has to say about assault and disturbing the peace." Harlan and the others moved to grab Ezekiel, but the mountain man remained unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on Blackwood with the patient focus of a predator. "The law," he said quietly, "works both ways." From inside his buckskin jacket, Ezekiel withdrew a folded paper, yellowed with age, but officially sealed. "I came to town for supplies, and to deliver this. I'd hoped to do it quietly, but perhaps public is better after all." He handed the document to the nearest townsperson, an elderly man everyone respected as fair-minded. "Read it, aloud if you would." The old man adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and began to read. "By order of the United States Federal Marshal's Office, Western Division, this document authorizes Captain Ezekiel Stone, formerly of the Union Army, to investigate allegations of land fraud, intimidation, and corruption in the territories of California and Nevada." The old man's voice trailed off as he looked up in astonishment. "This is a federal marshal's authorization. It names Walter Blackwood specifically." A shocked silence descended, broken only by Blackwood's incredulous laugh. "This is preposterous. That paper could be forged, and even if it were genuine, it's dated years ago, no longer valid." Ezekiel's expression remained impassive. "The authorization has no expiration. I've been gathering evidence for longer than you realize, Blackwood. Statements from families forced off their land in 3 territories, banking records showing suspicious transfers, testimonies about mysterious accidents befalling those who opposed you." He took a step forward, and despite the gun still trained on him, Blackwood instinctively retreated. "I've spent years in the wilderness, not just as a trapper, but as a man with a mission, and you've just added witness intimidation and conspiracy to deny legal contracts to the list of charges." Margaret watched in amazement as the power dynamic shifted before her eyes. Blackwood's men looked uncertain, glancing between their employer and Ezekiel as if reassessing their loyalties. The crowd's murmurs had taken on a different tone: excitement, anticipation of justice long denied. Blackwood himself seemed to physically shrink, his bluster giving way to calculation. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, his voice taking on an ingratiating tone that fooled no one. "Business disagreements happen in growing territories. Nothing criminal intended. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement that satisfies everyone." Ezekiel's response was measured but unyielding. "The arrangement is this. You will instruct the bank to honor its original contract with Miss Sullivan. You will cease all intimidation of her or her customers, and you will prepare to answer formal charges when the circuit judge arrives next month." The standoff that followed was tense but brief. Blackwood's men, sensing the change in the wind, slowly lowered their weapons. Even Harlan, despite his personal grudge, seemed unwilling to compound his employer's legal troubles by adding violence against a federal representative. Blackwood himself was visibly calculating his options, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and finally a crafty resignation. As I said, a misunderstanding. Of course, Miss Sullivan's contract will be honored, as originally agreed. He turned to the crowd with a politician's smile. "I've only ever wanted what's best for this town and its citizens. If there have been misinterpretations of my methods, I regret them sincerely." No one appeared convinced, but the immediate danger had passed. Blackwood retreated into the saloon, his men following, though not without backward glances at Ezekiel that promised this wasn't over. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with the morning's unexpected drama, Margaret found herself standing alone with Ezekiel in the dusty street. "A federal marshal," she said, studying him with new eyes. "You might have mentioned that when proposing marriage." The corner of Ezekiel's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Would it have made a difference? Margaret considered this. Perhaps, though not in the way you might think. She gestured toward her shop. "I believe we have a conversation to continue." As they walked, Margaret was acutely aware of the town's eyes following them, the whispers that now carried speculation rather than derision. By sundown, the story would have grown to legendary proportions. The mysterious mountain man revealed as a lawman in disguise, the standoff with the town's most powerful citizen, and most intriguingly, his apparent interest in the Sullivan woman. Inside the apothecary, with the door closed against curious onlookers, Margaret finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why did you keep your identity secret? Why live as a trapper in the mountains when you carry the authority of the law? Ezekiel set his hat on the counter, running a hand through his wild hair with a sigh. The mountains weren't just cover for my investigation. They were necessary for me. Something in his voice made Margaret wait patiently as he gathered his thoughts. During the war, I saw things, did things that changed me. Afterward, carrying a badge felt like a mockery. I couldn't be among people without seeing the worst in them, expecting betrayal about every corner. The mountains were honest, simple. They demanded everything, but asked nothing of my soul. He met her eyes, and Margaret saw in them a depth of pain and resilience that matched her own. I took the federal commission because it allowed me solitude while still serving some purpose. The investigation was something I could do at my own pace, in my own way. I've been tracking Blackwood's operations for years, watching him destroy lives across 3 territories. Today wasn't how I planned to confront him, but plans change. His gaze softened as it rested on her face. Sometimes for the better. Margaret felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. This man, this contradiction of wilderness and civilization, had defended her not once, but twice. First as a stranger with a sense of justice, then as a lawman with authority. Yet it was the man beneath both identities that intrigued her most. "About your proposal," she said, surprising herself with her directness. "Is it still open for consideration?" Ezekiel studied her face carefully. "It is, though circumstances have changed. Blackwood will honor your loan agreement for now. He has no choice with witnesses and the threat of federal charges. But he won't forget, and men like him always find ways to retaliate." Margaret nodded, having come to the same conclusion. "Then perhaps the arrangement still has merit, though for different reasons." She hesitated, then added, "But I would suggest an amendment to the terms." Ezekiel raised an eyebrow in question. "Not just a marriage of convenience, not just protection and financial security." She took a deep breath. "A real marriage, in all ways, to be built slowly perhaps, but with intention." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Ezekiel's expression remained unreadable, and Margaret began to regret her boldness. Then, slowly, he sank to one knee before her, for the second time that day. But this time, the gesture held none of the practical, businesslike quality of before. This time, when he took her hand in his massive, calloused one, Margaret felt the tremble in his fingers. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his deep voice rougher than usual, "I've spent 15 years in the wilderness, convinced I would never again know the company of others, much less the companionship of a woman. I came to town with a duty to fulfill and expected nothing more. Instead, I found you, brave, principled, and stronger than you know." He paused, seeming to search for words that didn't come easily to a man long accustomed to silence. "I would be honored to build a life with you, however you wish it to be." The weeks that followed transformed Redemption Creek in ways no one could have predicted. The circuit judge arrived earlier than expected, and Blackwood's legal troubles multiplied as townsfolk came forward with their own stories of intimidation and fraud. Released from his reign of fear, the community began to recover its sense of fairness and mutual support. Margaret's shop flourished once more, with customers returning openly and new ones seeking her expertise. And most surprising of all was the mountain man, who now moved easily between town and wilderness, still more comfortable under the open sky than beneath a roof, but making the effort to bridge both worlds. Ezekiel and Margaret were married by the circuit judge himself in a simple ceremony attended by the entire town. Their unconventional union became something of a local legend. The refined doctor's daughter and the wild mountain man, both survivors in their own ways, finding in each other something neither had expected to discover in this harsh territory. Margaret expanded her practice, finally able to use her medical knowledge openly, treating patients who had previously suffered without proper care. Ezekiel's federal authority provided protection, but it was his quiet strength and unwavering support that gave Margaret the confidence to step fully into her father's legacy. Their home became a unique blend of civilized comfort and frontier practicality. Medicinal herbs hung from rafters alongside cured meats and pelts. Books of medicine shared shelves with handcrafted hunting tools. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch overlooking the town, Margaret reading aloud from her father's medical journals, while Ezekiel carved intricate wooden figures, his massive hands displaying surprising delicacy. Townsfolk grew accustomed to seeking help at all hours, knowing they would find both healing for their bodies and the reassurance of Ezekiel's protective presence. And if some still whispered about the strangeness of their match, neither Margaret nor Ezekiel paid it any mind. They had both endured far worse than gossip. As summer gave way to autumn, and the mountains donned their golden mantle, Ezekiel took Margaret to his cabin high in the Sierra Nevada. The journey was arduous, but Margaret found herself exhilarated rather than exhausted, seeing the wilderness through her husband's knowing eyes. The cabin itself was Spartan but solidly built, perched on a ridge overlooking a valley of such breathtaking beauty that Margaret understood instantly why Ezekiel had chosen this remote sanctuary. "It needs a woman's touch," he said apologetically as he showed her the simple interior. Margaret smiled, touching his bearded cheek gently. "It needs both our touches now." That night, as a mountain storm raged outside and they lay close beneath firs, sharing warmth and whispered stories, Margaret realized that she had found not just security, but a love as vast and untamed as the mountains themselves. Winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving. The mountain passes closed, and Redemption Creek settled in for the long, cold months of isolation. Margaret and Ezekiel divided their time between town and wilderness, bringing supplies and medicine to outlying homesteads when travel was possible. It was during one such journey, returning from helping a family whose child had taken ill with fever, that disaster struck. The snow had been falling steadily for days, and the path back to town followed a narrow ridge. Without warning, the ledge beneath their horses gave way, a hidden weakness undermined by freezing and thawing. Margaret felt herself falling, heard Ezekiel's desperate shout, and then knew only cold and darkness as the snow enveloped her. She awoke to pain and the smell of pine smoke. Opening her eyes slowly, Margaret found herself in an unfamiliar cabin, smaller and rougher than Ezekiel's mountain home. A trapper's line shack, she realized. One of the emergency shelters scattered throughout the high country for exactly such emergencies. Her leg was splinted and bound, and every breath brought a sharp pain in her ribs. But most distressing was the absence of her husband. Struggling to sit up, Margaret called his name, her voice weak in the close confines of the cabin. The door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and the massive form of Ezekiel, his arms laden with firewood. The naked relief on his face as he saw her awake made Margaret's heart clench. "I thought I'd lost you," he said simply, dropping the wood and crossing to her side in 2 long strides. The story emerged gradually as Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness over the next days. The avalanche had carried them nearly 100 feet down the mountainside. Ezekiel had dug her out of the snow with his bare hands, finding her unconscious with a broken leg and several cracked ribs. One of their horses had survived, and he had managed to get her to this line shack just as another storm closed in, cutting off any hope of reaching town. Now they were trapped, with limited supplies and Margaret's injuries making travel impossible even if the weather cleared. Ezekiel had set her leg using knowledge gained from years of surviving wilderness injuries, but the pain and fever that followed concerned him deeply. "We need to get you to town, to proper medical care," he said, frustration evident in every line of his powerful body as he paced the small cabin. Margaret, despite her pain, found herself moved by the depth of this man's concern. This husband who had begun as a stranger offering protection and had become the center of her world in mere months. "You did well, Ezekiel," she assured him, gesturing to the splint. "The bone is straight, and the fever is already lessening. I'm a doctor's daughter, remember? I know when healing has begun." He knelt beside her pallet, taking her small hand between his large ones. "I've survived blizzards, bear attacks, and ambushes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But seeing you buried in that snow, not knowing if you were alive or dead, I've never known fear like that." Margaret squeezed his hand weakly. "It seems I've claimed more of your heart than either of us anticipated when we made our arrangement." Ezekiel's laugh was soft and without humor. "You claimed it the moment you stood in that bank, chin high despite your tears, refusing to be broken by men who couldn't recognize true strength." He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture so tender from such a formidable man that Margaret felt tears gathering. "I meant what I said that day, about building a life together. I just didn't realize how quickly that life would become the only one worth fighting for." The confession from a man who measured his words as carefully as his powder and shot was more precious to Margaret than any declaration of love in flowery verse. She tugged gently at his beard, drawing him closer until their foreheads touched. "Then fight for it now, for us. Get us through this winter. And I promise you, springs beyond counting." The weeks that followed tested them both. The winter of 1878 would later be recorded as the most severe in living memory, with storms that buried entire settlements and temperatures that froze mercury solid. In their small shelter, Margaret and Ezekiel survived on carefully rationed supplies, supplemented by whatever game Ezekiel could trap or hunt during brief breaks in the weather. Margaret's injuries healed slowly but steadily, and as her strength returned, so did her determination to make even this desperate situation serve a purpose. She insisted that Ezekiel teach her wilderness skills, how to read weather patterns and cloud formations, how to set snares for rabbits, how to preserve meat without salt. In return, she shared her medical knowledge, showing him how to identify medicinal plants even beneath snow cover, how to treat frostbite before it claimed fingers or toes, how to stitch wounds with sinew when proper sutures weren't available. By the time the first thaw came in late March, Margaret could walk with the aid of a crudely fashioned crutch, and Ezekiel had expanded his trapper's medical knowledge tenfold. They emerged from the line shack to find a world transformed by winter's fury. Familiar landmarks buried or altered, trails obliterated, the very shape of the mountainside changed by avalanches and fallen trees. The journey back to Redemption Creek would be challenging even for two healthy travelers. For Margaret, still weak from her ordeal, it would be a supreme test of endurance. Ezekiel studied the terrain with experienced eyes, then turned to her with determination. "It won't be easy or comfortable," he warned, "but I'll get you home if I have to carry you every step of the way." Margaret smiled, leaning on her crutch, but standing as straight as her healing body allowed. "We'll get home together," she corrected gently, "as we've done everything else since the day you walked into my shop." The town had nearly given them up for dead when they finally emerged from the high country trail, Margaret riding their remaining horse while Ezekiel walked beside them, leading the way with the patient strength that had become her anchor. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the main street, it seemed all of Redemption Creek had turned out to witness what many were already calling a miracle. Sheriff Wilson, who had organized several failed rescue attempts during winter breaks, was the first to reach them, his weathered face creased with relief. "Thought we'd be searching for your bodies come full thaw," he said bluntly, helping Margaret down from the horse while other men clapped Ezekiel on the back in wordless welcome. "Nearly was the case," Ezekiel replied, his eyes never leaving Margaret as she was surrounded by townswomen exclaiming over her condition. That night, as they finally lay in their own bed in the rooms above the apothecary, Margaret nestled against Ezekiel's solid warmth. listening to the spring rain pattering on the roof. "They're calling it the miracle on the mountain," she said, her voice drowsy with exhaustion and comfort. But the real miracle happened months ago, when a mountain man walked into a bank and defended a woman's tears. Ezekiel's arms tightened around her, his breath warm against her hair. "I'd do it again, 1,000 times over." Margaret smiled in the darkness, placing her hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat. "I know, that's why I love you." The words, spoken for the first time without fear or reservation, seemed to fill the room with their simple truth. Ezekiel was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his deep voice carried all the certainty of a man who had found his true north after years of wandering. "And I love you, Margaret Stone, more than mountains, more than freedom, more than life itself." As spring bloomed into summer, Redemption Creek witnessed another transformation. The mountain man who had once avoided civilization now stood proudly beside his wife as she expanded her practice, using his federal authority to ensure that no one, regardless of wealth or position, could interfere with her work. Margaret's medical skills, combined with Ezekiel's wilderness knowledge, created a unique healing practice that served not just the town, but outlying settlements and Native American camps as well. They began training apprentices, young men and women, who would carry their combined wisdom to other frontier communities. And when autumn painted the mountains gold once more, they led their first medical expedition into the high country, bringing care to trappers and prospectors who had never before had access to such services. The following year brought changes to Redemption Creek that few could have imagined. With Blackwood's corrupt influence removed, the town began to thrive as an honest trading center. Margaret's apothecary expanded into a proper clinic, with Ezekiel adding a wing built from logs he harvested and prepared himself. Their reputation spread throughout the territory. The doctor's daughter, who had defied convention to practice medicine, and the formidable mountain man who had traded solitude for partnership. Their marriage, begun as an arrangement of convenience, had become a testament to the possibility of finding unexpected love in the harsh reality of frontier life. And if sometimes Ezekiel disappeared into the mountains alone for days, returning with game and medicinal plants, but also the scented calm that solitude gave him, Margaret understood. Their love wasn't about possession, but freedom. The freedom to be fully themselves, together and apart. On the anniversary of their meeting, Ezekiel took Margaret back to the high ridge where his cabin stood. The structure had been expanded and improved over the years, becoming their summer refuge from the increasing bustle of town. As they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Sierra Nevada in shades of fire, Ezekiel took Margaret's hand, his touch as reverent as it had been the first time. "1 year ago, I walked into town a broken man, hiding in the guise of a mountain hermit, carrying old ghosts and a badge I no longer believed in. I expected nothing but supplies and perhaps the closure of an old case." His blue eyes, softened by months of happiness but still sharp as a hawk's, held hers steadily. "Instead, I found a woman whose tears moved me more than any words could have. Tears not of weakness, but of righteous anger, of determination despite impossible odds." Margaret smiled, remembering that day in the bank when her world had seemed to be ending, unaware that it was actually beginning anew. "And I found a man who saw value in me when others saw only a woman who didn't know her place, who knelt before me not once but twice, first offering protection, then offering his heart." She leaned against his solid strength, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They still talk about it in town, you know? The day the mountain man defended my tears and then fell to his knees. They've turned it into quite the romantic tale. Ezekiel's laugh rumbled through his chest. For once, the gossips have it right, though they'll never know the full story. How much courage it took for you to build a new life with a wild man from the mountains, or how completely that wild man was tamed by your healing hands. As darkness fell completely, wrapping the mountains in velvet shadows pierced by starlight, Margaret and Ezekiel remained on their porch, two souls who had found in each other not just love, but purpose, not just companionship, but completion. The mountain man and the doctor's daughter, brought together by tears and justice, bound by respect and love. Their story would be told in Redemption Creek for generations, how he had defended her when no one else would, how she had seen the man beneath the wilderness exterior, how together they had built something stronger than either could have created alone. And though the telling would change with each retelling, growing more romantic or more adventurous depending on the teller, the heart of it would remain true. That sometimes love begins in unexpected moments. When someone finally sees your tears and knows their worth,